It's not very impressive over this.
Oh, boy.
Well, I guess the mics are
Yep, mine works fine.
doing.
All right, we're good to go.
Okay. Now calling the March 3rd, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. Mr. Kane, will you take roll?
Commissioner Friedrich,
Here.
Commissioner Hovlis,
Here.
Commissioner Honig,
Here.
Commissioner Irwin, Commissioner Kingsworthy,
Here.
Commissioner Leash,
Here.
Commissioner Ortman.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda.
Move to approve.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes for the February 3rd, 2022 regular meeting.
Move to approve?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes for the February 3rd, 2022 work session.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is the Zoning Board of Appeals report. Commissioner Friedrich?
Madam Chair, we did not meet.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is communications. Mr. Kane?
There are no communications this evening, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And next item on the agenda is TC 2202. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our first item tonight is a public hearing on text change 2202. This text change would amend the definition of liquor stores in the zoning ordinance to add exclusions for businesses that are otherwise licensed and approved to serve alcoholic beverages on premise. So essentially providing for businesses like Class 1 restaurants and hotels that may provide carryout alcohol sales or service as an accessory to their principal uses, just kind of further aligning that definition with both existing liquor licensing practices in the city and also with sort of a general understanding of what a liquor store constitutes. So staff's recommendation is that after the public hearing, the Planning Commission recommend that the City Commission adopt the text change as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. And any questions for Mr. Kane? And I will open up the public hearing for public comment if there's anyone that would like to comment.
Madam Chair, we don't have any electronic communications at this time. We also do not have any parties on Zoom to comment.
Thank you. I will close public comment and open up discussion.
Move to recommend that the City Commission adopt text change 2202?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is TC 2203. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I apologize, realizing my slides, I'm still living in 2021. The text change 2203 is a proposed amendment that would establish a minor site plan review process. So the Planning Commission will recall that we previously discussed this in October at work session in terms of general direction that the Planning Commission was comfortable with considering. And so I'd just like to go really quickly through the items that this ordinance would create an opportunity for minor site plan review for. And so under the proposed ordinance, items that would be eligible for minor site plan review include modifications to existing principal buildings with a change of footprint of 10% or less, new accessory buildings or structures with a footprint of 200 square feet or less. That's consistent with the threshold that's also applied under the city's stormwater ordinance for exemption. Modifications to existing accessory buildings or structures which change the footprint by less than 200 square feet. Reconstruction of existing parking areas impacting 2,600 square feet or less of existing impervious surface with changes to the striping or layout. Again, that's consistent with thresholds that exist in the city's stormwater ordinance. Alterations or modifications to existing parking area striping plans or driveways. Installation, modification, or removal of required or regulated private landscaping, screens, or streetscapes. And installation, modification, or removal of outdoor dining areas, bicycle parking, private sidewalks, cross-access connections, dumpster enclosures, mechanical equipment, electric car charging stations, or other site elements as approved by the city planner. This ordinance would also expand the exemption from site plan review. Currently, the exemption exists only for single-family residential properties. Under the proposed ordinance, items exempted from site plan review, including minor site plan review, would include single-family dwellings and all site improvements related to the principal use of a single property for a single-family residential use, reconstruction of existing parking areas impacting 2,600 square feet or less of existing impervious surface without any changes to the striping or layout, and installation, modification, or removal of landscaping or fencing not associated with private landscaping, screening, street screen, or streetscape requirements. So essentially, any of those elements that are not implemented as part of a code requirement. As mentioned in the work session and in the introduction last month, the primary benefit of this would be to streamline the ability of property owners to make these improvements. And we would also hope that this would provide for the incremental increase in compliance of existing sites around the city in meeting our code requirements and expectations. If approved, we would look for the city commission to ultimately implement a fee associated with minor site plan review. I would anticipate that that fee will likely be significantly lower than our site plan review fee, given the lower complexity of those projects. So I'll conclude my presentation by recommending that you recommend to the City Commission adoption of text change 2203. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Any questions for Mr. Kane? I'll open up public comment in the event there is someone that wants to make a comment to this hearing.
Madam Chair, we don't have any electronic comments at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. I will close public comment and open up discussion.
Move to recommend that the City Commission adopt text change 2203.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is public comment. This is the last opportunity for anyone from the public to comment. Mr. Kane, is there any electronic communications at this point?
There's not.
Thank you. I will close public comment. And next item on the agenda is discuss amendment to section 154-410B4 of the zoning ordinance regarding numeric limits for adult use marijuana establishments and medical marijuana facilities, and consider setting a public hearing on this issue for the April 7th, 2022 regular meeting. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This ordinance would remove redundant numeric limits that exist in the zoning ordinance for medical marijuana facilities and adult use marijuana establishments. When the regulatory and zoning ordinances for these uses were adopted, those limits were mirrored in both sets of ordinances. So staff's recommendation as part of an overall revision that the City Commission is contemplating to the regulatory ordinances would be for those redundant license caps to be eliminated from the zoning code. They would remain within chapters 112 and 115, which are the regulatory ordinances for the respective licensing processes for these uses. So this would just simply remove that redundancy and ensure that there's not any potential for conflict between the adopted standards in both of those ordinances. So that's the effect that this ordinance would take. It will essentially replace those limits with a reference to the respective regulatory code that applies to each use. And staff is recommending that you set a public hearing on this text change for your April meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Any questions for Mr. Kane?
Just so I'm clear, so this is not functionally any different than what we have now. It just streamlines it.
Correct.
It doesn't change the code in any way.
It would change the zoning code,
Right.
but the limits as they
But
exist.
not functionally.
Correct, because the regulatory limits are the same, and those will, at this point, remain as currently adopted in the zoning code in the regulatory ordinance as well.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Kane? Any discussion or motion?
Move to set a public hearing to consider the proposed text change at the April 7th, 2022 regular meeting.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Next item on the agenda is stacking requirements for drive-through businesses. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our next item is a referral from the City Commission. At their January 24th meeting, they requested that the Planning Commission review the stacking requirements for drive-through businesses and outline potential regulatory options. The stacking requirements were first implemented in the city's zoning ordinance in 1984. 1984 was the year of the previous zoning ordinance creation, and so there was a full rewrite of the zoning code from 1971 in 1984 that was adopted in March of 1984, and at that time, that code implemented stacking standards for a variety of uses. Drive-through businesses are regulated as special uses under the zoning code, and so it does require a special use permit to have a drive-through business within the city of Mount Pleasant. The primary purpose of a stacking requirement is to provide space on site for vehicles to queue while they're waiting for drive-through service. So the idea being that that drive-through service window is going to require some waiting space for folks who are looking to access it. The requirement under the code since 1984 for a drive-through restaurant has been 10 stacking spaces or 200 feet, so 20 feet per stacking space. On the screen, you'll see an image just to illustrate what a stacking lane or a queue lane is. This is a graphic depiction of the Taco Bell restaurant in Mount Pleasant on South Mission Street. And you'll see that the automobiles that are shown on this map, I guess I could point at your screen since you're looking up here. Maybe I can't. The red cars that are shown on that depict that area of the stacking lane. And you'll see in this image that that stacking lane does accommodate, I think in this case, it actually shows 11 vehicles, if I remember counting correctly. Nope, it's 10. But that stack begins at the window on the side of the building and wraps around. And you'll note, consistent with code, in addition to having a stacking distance, that stacking lane can't interfere with site circulation or access to parking spaces. And so in this case, you'll note that there is an ability to bypass that stacking lane to the right or to the east around the building, and that stacking lane is outside of the parking area, so that full 200 foot of stacking is provided without interfering with other elements of the site circulation. Again, with the end goal of ensuring that the stacking activity that takes place because of the drive-through window doesn't spill out into the public street or over the sidewalk. On the screen, you'll see a photograph of an actual stacking lane here in the community. So this is the South Mission Street McDonald's, and this photo was taken from the west side of the property, looking back towards the east, towards Mission Street. And so you'll see here that the stacking actually wraps around the both sides and the back of the building. The McDonald's on South Mission Street is one of 2 restaurants in the community, the other being the McDonald's on East Pickard, that have a double loaded stacking lane. And so you'll see that there's 2 stacking lanes to the left on the north side of the site that ultimately combine into 1 stacking lane to provide stacking for the drive-through windows, which are located on the south or on the right side of the image. Just some general reminders about the stacking requirement as regulated through the special use permit. All special use permits run with property, not with the property owner or the business. And so if a special use permit is issued by the city, that special use permit can continue to be used by that property, even if the business activity changes. Presumably it would be the same use category. So for instance, if a McDonald's was replaced by a Wendy's or a Starbucks, and there was a special use permit, so long as that new business operated consistently with the standards applied at the time of the special use permit being issued, that special use permit would continue in perpetuity and could be transferred from business to business. Staff did an analysis of existing drive-through lanes in the community and found that the average stacking length for a drive-through restaurant is 227 feet. There are 22 businesses in the community that are operating with legally existing, either a legally conforming or legally non-conforming drive-through in the community. 19 of those have stacking that meets or exceeds the current requirement. Staff also looked at existing drive-through banks and found that 4 of the 6 meet the drive-through standards or exceed them. I will note that drive-through banks prior to 2018 were considered a separate use and had a separate stacking standard of 3 spaces per window. And so they are currently, those 2 that are not conforming are grandfathered in essentially because the standard for a drive-through bank has changed and increased under the current code. I mentioned that staff had compiled data on all of the drive-through windows in the community that are legally existing. And so you'll see on the left side of the screen, those 22 restaurants that are operating with drive-through windows. We have a range of stacking distance from 95 feet for the Arby's on South Mission to 400 feet for the Rallies on South Mission, with an average of 227 feet. Staff also calculated the overflow that exists on site. So as I mentioned when describing the Taco Bell diagram, the required stacking lane cannot interfere with site circulation, but in most cases, the stacking lanes are set back into the site. And so there is additional space on private property where, should there be an overflow from that stack, there's still space within the site to accommodate that. And so staff calculated that for all of those restaurants and found that the average total overflow, so this is the stack including the overflow area, was 319 feet. You'll note, too, that only 2 of the 22 restaurants lack 200 foot of on-site stacking area compliant with the stacking requirement and plus that overflow, those being the KFC on North Mission and the Big B on South Mission. Staff also looked at other categories of drive-through businesses. I mentioned the banks. The average bank stacking distance was 311 feet, and the average total with overflow was 406. I looked at pharmacies as well. There are 6 pharmacies in the community with an average stack of 183 feet and a total with overflow of 327. Drive-through pharmacies and other drive-through business uses were not regulated at all prior to 2018. And so those pharmacies were not required to have any stacking at all if they had a drive-through window. They would be today under the code required to have that 200 foot of stack. And then finally, there were 2 businesses that didn't fit into the other categories, one being the Miller's Quality Cleaners on South Mission, which has a pickup window and a total stacking distance of 20 feet, and the John's Drive-In on South Mission, which obviously is functionally, operationally different from a traditional drive-through. They provide 24 service stalls within that drive-through establishment, and each of them has the opportunity for 1 stack for each of those service stalls. So as I mentioned, the referral requested that the Planning Commission consider what regulatory options might exist regarding the city's regulation of stacking. Staff has outlined some potential options for consideration, and there may be other options that the Planning Commission would like to include in that review. I'll just quickly go through that list. Option 1 would be to maintain the 200 foot stacking requirement as has existed since 1984. 2 would be to modify the requirement to account for the characteristics of different drive-through uses. And so this would be splitting it out based on restaurants, banks, dry cleaners, or other potential drive-through uses. 3 would be to modify the requirement based on characteristics of the business. So we could look at the building size, seating capacity, a percent of business by drive-through or other. 4 would be to modify the requirement for all drive-through establishments to a different length than 200 feet, whether that was longer or shorter. Option 5 would be to consider elimination of the requirement altogether. And then, as I said, option 6 would be any other options the Planning Commission may identify in their conversation. And so that concludes my presentation, and I'll turn it over to the Planning Commission for discussion. I would encourage you to be creative. If you have any ideas that you want to include on this list, staff will be preparing a communication to the City Commission based on tonight's conversation. If the Planning Commission feels that there are certain options that are better or worse, or that you're supportive of or not supportive of, I would be interested in that information as well to include in that communication. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. What's everyone's thoughts on the drive-through stacking issue?
I have a question for Mr. Kane about this too. For the 2 McDonald's that have the double stacking lane, is where they're double stacked, is that counted the distance twice in there, or is it just considered a single lane? So does double stacking give them more within the requirement?
That's a good question. When calculated, I did not include the double stack in the count. So this is just as though that second lane did not exist for those 2 McDonald's, and it is just those 2 McDonald's restaurants in the community that have a double stack drive-through.
Well, I was just thinking that in the future that may be a more popular option for different restaurants to go. So maybe making a decision about whether we count that as whatever distance we decide on.
Yeah, there's certainly an evolution in that, and I will tell you, it's interesting. I looked back in doing this research at the staff report for the McDonald's remodel on East Pickard, and that McDonald's, when it was originally built, didn't have a drive-through window at all.
Oh, wow.
And so, very, very different times back then. Obviously, now there's a great deal more activity through the McDonald's drive-through at various hours of the day. Certainly, it's one of the busier drive-through windows in the community.
I have a question about bullet point number 3, with regards to percentage of business by drive-through or other maybe seating capacity. Can you speak to that in terms of data you might have considered? That is to say, would a restaurant be able to provide data in terms of this is what we've had in the past, this is what we expect, and how would they limit that if they were to kind of say this is all we get for drive-through? Is that a legitimate question?
I think the answer is it would be difficult, simply because we would be asking a business to turn over their private financials to make that determination. And to the extent I could find any information on the regulation of drive-through stacking, I wasn't able to locate a community that regulated it in that manner, nor any data to show whether there was a relationship between that. I think the trick would be, if you have a really large restaurant with many receipts, you may have a small percentage of your activity being through the drive-through, but that still may be a lot of activity through the drive-through. And vice versa. You may have a relatively low traffic drive-through that constitutes a huge amount of the business. It may just be a business that doesn't have a tremendous amount of activity. I would also expect that those are more mutable characteristics. So the physical structure of a business is more permanent. Things like receipts on a bill could change week to week, month to month, and over time. I do think that presents a challenge. The other issue at hand is just simply because of the nature of special use permits, and they're tied to the property, not the business. I think that further complicates a regulation that it takes place on the basis of an operational, that type of operational characteristic of the business that is so fluid, and that the city doesn't have a ready way to monitor. Certainly, we can monitor hours of operation easily, but it's not possible for us to drive past a restaurant and observe that its revenues have changed.
I honestly don't think that's a great option for us to use for criteria too, because probably all of you have seen like a little coffee hut that's sitting somewhere, and right before work, that line might be 20 cars long. So I wouldn't want to use the square feet of that to determine how much lane they need, because it could vary wildly. So
yeah, and I pulled square footage for the restaurants in the community that have approved drive-throughs, and those numbers vary, within essentially a range of about 1,500 to 5,000 square feet, average of being about 3,000 square feet. I was surprised to see that there doesn't appear to be a clear relationship between the drive-throughs that I would consider to be the most active and those that are less active in terms of square footage. So those McDonald's restaurants, for instance, are quite large, and they generate a lot of drive-through activity. And so, I was surprised to see that. I was surprised to find that they were as large in size as they are. Kind of conversely, there are some other drive-throughs that are also very busy that are operating out of much smaller buildings. So again, I didn't find examples elsewhere of communities regulating on the basis of size. And I didn't find within our community that there seemed to be a correlation in the volume of activity on the basis of square footage. My other concern with regulating by square footage is that if we have an existing business with an approved drive-through and they want to expand, or if they contract the size of their business operation for some reason, then I think that puts us in an awkward position to try to address the drive-through's existence as a legal use. And it may create an unintended disincentive for investment in the property in order to maintain that ability to have the drive-through.
I also think it would be difficult for new business to predict just how much drive-through business they would have. If they didn't exist before, they wouldn't have any data, so that would make it too hard for new
Right.
business.
So can we just eliminate that one, Jacob?
Oh,
That criteria, the modify the requirement and differentiate based on size or another characteristic. I can't think of another characteristic we could use that would be
well,
better.
what I would suggest based on the referral to be complete would be that the referral or the response to the referral will include all the options that were discussed. And if the planning commission, as I said, if there's a consensus that one or more options are more desirable or less desirable from the planning commission's perspective, that I would be happy to include that in the communication.
So I know that the special use permit is tied to the property, but is there any way to make any concessions with that would be like limited per the ownership, like that special use would end with the current ownership of the transfer of ownership or something like that?
There's not a way to do that with a land use entitlement that's going to run with the property. So,
Because in some ways, I mean, I really like the standardization of bank to restaurant business kind of thing, just because we have some empty bank buildings that were, because of that standardization, they could very easily transfer over to, we now have a coffee house in one of them, and, and so that transferability of ease for a new business to go in is pretty easy in that condition. But then we have our current situations that, I'm not so sure some things that might apply very nicely with some of our very busy larger, commercial doesn't necessarily fit very well with some of our small businesses locally. So I'm just kind of, how can we do it to support every part of our community? I guess that's where I'm trying to figure out. I've been trying to wrestle with, trying to come up with an idea of what would make it work.
And you're exactly right that there has been conversion between drive-through, different categories of drive-through businesses over time. And you correctly identified the Creation Coffee that recently opened in the former Chemical Bank building. There's been some expressed interest in the PNC Bank that's closed on North Mission for some other potential business types, some of which might include a drive-through element. The Smoothie King, the Smoothie King location was at one point approved to be a bank drive-through, and ultimately ended up that didn't move forward and it became a Smoothie King drive-through. But I could see that's the type of situation where that space would be easily converted. Yeah. And there's examples all around the city of we have a car dealership where the McDonald's once was, and those things do change over time.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I assume that if there was any kind of data or incidents with regards to overflows that impacted traffic, in negative ways, that would be related here. I'm just asking for the purpose of with regards to eliminating the requirement or changing the requirement, having any validity or any merit.
Well, I can think of two examples. I don't know if you remember when the Popeyes first opened. People were so excited about it that even though they had the 200 feet, people were backing up onto High Street, and the police had to direct traffic in there because it was just too dangerous for that high traffic area. And then the other one is the Meyer Pharmacy. When I always park on the side of the building by the pharmacy, and that 60 feet is just not enough, and people are always in the drive lane right there. So 60 feet is clearly not enough. And in some cases, maybe 200 feet isn't enough when something's new. So.
Yeah, I've had it asked, where did the current standard come from? And because in large part because the standards were adopted as part of a full rewrite of the zoning code, and because that happened 30 7 years ago, all going on 38 years ago this week, I think. We don't have clear evidence of where the standard came from, but I think there's curious timing in that the pickup window for the KFC restaurant was established in 1982. And that is one location that I have noted frequently overflows. And that business has 160 feet of queuing. And so the 200 foot of queuing would be larger than that, not significantly larger, but it certainly would seem like there may have been a correlation there between that. And that, as best I can tell, was the earliest drive-through window in the city, was at that drive-through window at KFC in 1982. And so there's at least appears to be some relationship there between that situation and those standards. In terms of enforcement, I think passive enforcement is always the easiest way to handle enforcement. So having things designed to achieve the desired outcome is always going to be the preferable way to handle it. We don't have enough enforcement staff at the city to be dealing with that situation, and I'm not sure that the city would have I'm not sure how we would go about doing that. If we had a drive-through frequently backing up, if we'd be ticketing the property owner or the drivers, or how that would work, revoking the special use permit. I'm not sure there's a lot of great options there. The one thing we can't do once we've approved a use to exist is go back and ask the property owner to change it. They have that right at that point to operate as approved, and they have that right forever. And so it's not, we don't have that ability to go back and after the fact and say, this didn't work, we need you to change it. Now, if they come forward later and want to expand or do something different, we may have the opportunity to make some improvements, but by and large, we're going to be living with that condition for the long term.
And for those reasons too, I don't think it's a great idea to eliminate the requirement. I think just for safety, I wouldn't be interested in eliminating it. And I thought having different uses with different lengths was kind of a nice way to go about it. But then you made a really good point that when one business switches from one to another, that is super convenient if they're all the same and they can just move right in there. So
Yeah, I mean, if there's a special use already tied to the property, it doesn't mean that a bank always has to go into a big
Right,
building.
exactly.
I mean, it can be,
And then Jacob gave plenty of examples of where that's happened in the city already.
right.
No.
Do we have any idea like what's typical in other communities that regulate drive-throughs?
I did some very limited searching on that and found a variety of answers. It appears most communities have some type of standard. It's not all premised on the same dimension type criteria that the city of Mount Pleasant uses. I think I saw anywhere from 100 foot to 200 feet being pretty typical. One main difference I would point out, though, in many of those communities, and something that existed under the city's former ordinance too, was that until 2018, the city of Mount Pleasant required a 75-foot setback for a drive-through from the right-of-way line, which is where a lot of that overflow space exists for these businesses. And in most communities, the building itself is required to be set back at a pretty significant length from the public right-of-way. And the city of Mount Pleasant, of course, we are regulating businesses based on their closeness to the public right-of-way line. And so I think given that, in all likelihood, a longer queue in the city of Mount Pleasant would be more necessary because we don't have other standards that are resulting in a longer queue by default. If you have a 75 or 100 foot building setback, and then you have 100 foot of queuing, you by effect have 200 foot of queuing on that property.
But relative to that question, do other cities, do other municipalities have enforcement options that we might consider here with regards to this? I mean, for example, I keep thinking, my mind keeps going back to an example of a friendly Mexican neighborhood restaurant that happens to be near a busy street, which wants to have a drive-through at the back window. And they, suddenly find themselves with a stack that goes into Mission Street, could an enforcement situation be implemented at that point if we were to, I don't know, I'm trying to think creatively, so.
I just think it's also a tough task to do, and in practice, I don't even know when people even give up speeding tickets in this town. So there's a lot of cases where enforcement doesn't seem to, be going on, so that might be a much different budget model more than what we can, foresee at this point.
I mean, it would just be a more reactive approach than a proactive approach to ensuring that sites are properly designed. And like I said, I'm not disputing that there may be options to conduct enforcement, but the practical effect of that enforcement, unless it's taking place every day, I think, with the exception of some of the situations like Commissioner Friedrich described, where you might have a grand opening condition where activity at a business is not at its normal level. I think most businesses' operations tend to be fairly consistent. And so if we have a recurring stacking issue, or I should say, if we have a stacking issue one day, it's likely going to be a recurring stacking issue that's happening at similar times every day, or every day that's like that day. And I'm not sure that enforcement is really viable, because there may be different people in that stack every day. And I don't think we have enough resources at hand at the city to be patrolling drive-through stacking on a daily basis.
And other than the example you used for KFC, where that does back up a little bit, too, have we had any incidents with those that are at the current standard 200 feet, where we've noticed that there's been a consistent problem?
In terms of my observation, I have witnessed overflow conditions at the three shortest stacks in the community, which is Arby's, KFC, and Big B.
Oh, right.
I have also observed backup conditions at Taco Bell, which greatly exceeds our standard. I have witnessed overflow at the South Mission McDonald's. Actually, very late at night, which I was surprised to see. And I think that is it. Now, I will also say that I have observed other stacks that have been full, but not overflowing. So I've seen the Pixie drive-through backed, like completely full back to, is that Lincoln Street or Chippewa Lincoln? Chippewa Street. I'm going to get that right. I've been at the back of that queue before. And actually, now that I think about it, I've actually seen, there's been vehicles in the street waiting behind me in that drive-through before. So, I mean, we haven't, I'm not going to claim it would take us a great deal of time to go out and survey and collect data on every single existing drive-through in the community. So that's just anecdotally. I think most of the others, Culver's has a tremendous amount of overflow space. Most of these do have a lot of extra space. And the handful that regularly overflow, like KFC and Big B, they do overflow into a city street, not a state road, where it is a lower volume of traffic and a lower traffic speed. Not that that's necessarily a desirable condition, but it may be less problematic than a stack that extends out into an MDOT facility.
So is it safe to say, Jacob, that the 200 foot is working? You could, I mean, the overflow here at Arby's, KFC, Big B, those are the shortest ones. Those are the ones that were grandfathered in. Those are the ones that overflow. Everyone else, it doesn't seem to be an issue unless the new chicken sandwich comes into town and everyone wants to get it. I agree with, a bank has a certain stack, a dry cleaner has a certain stack, and a restaurant has a certain stack. I think that makes the most sense. I mean, like you said, it's for the friendly taco, the taco boy, the elephant in the room is the taco boy. This is why it's on our plate. He doesn't have the 200 feet, don't have the 200 feet. I don't. So that's my 2 cents.
Well, just for sake of comparison, looking at the numbers for that particular scenario, the stacking with overflow to the public right of way
Okay.
is 170 feet. So that would place that on the shorter end of the spectrum in terms of the items on this list. The code compliant stack that doesn't interfere with access to parking is actually only 80 feet in distance. So it would be the shortest drive-through in the city for a drive-through restaurant. It'd be the third shortest of all drive-throughs overall. And I think it's important to, to your question, the standard has been in place for 38 years, and we haven't had any issues with obtaining compliance from any of the businesses listed here in that time. And it appears that even with that 200 foot of stacking and a significant amount of overflow, we do occasionally still experience some spillover into the street, not on a daily basis, but at rare occasions that does still occur. I would also note that it appears that the 200 foot of stacking space could be met in the instance at hand. And so there's just an unwillingness on the part of the business owner to make the site changes necessary to accomplish that. But making those changes would ensure that over the long haul, as that business may change either in its operational characteristics or in its ownership, that site doesn't result in an unsafe condition on the public roadway.
And just to echo my fellow commissioner, I think it is like, you can't, if there's some spillover, you can't have like the cops out there handing tickets. If you think a business owner's upset now, do you wait until you think you're singling out their clients just because they're up to code and is it their fault because they're too busy, then it's overflowing? I don't think that's a viable option, so I do agree.
So Jacob, I just want to, you said that as it currently stands, that they're 170 with the overflow, right?
Yes, so
Okay.
from that pickup window back to the closest driveway to the pickup window, it's 170 feet in total. And that's how the overflow is measured for every other business as well. Many of those businesses have multiple points of access. And so that overflow distance was measured going to the closest from the end of the stacking lane. So in some cases, so like as an example, the Panda Express, that overflow stacking of 250 feet is measured out to the driveway on South Mission Street. Certainly, if there were additional people desiring to access the drive-through, they could also overflow stack coming off of Bellows Street, and you'd have probably another 100 plus feet of on-site capacity. In the event that there was a super sale on orange chicken that had everybody in town lined up to get it, there would still be an opportunity there for some additional on-site stacking. That would be true in the other instance as well. The business that is currently operating with an illegal drive-through, there is an opportunity for some additional on-site stacking. There would be overflow stacking, so not stacking meeting the code. That would be stacking that would interfere with site circulation and access to the only customer parking that's present on site. But just to be fair, that would also exist in that condition, but it would be lesser than in most of the other instances.
Just so we can cover everything, all the examples you have here, if we were to do or recommend longer than 200 feet, would that be prohibitive to some of the property sizes for commercial businesses that would be difficult to go to 250 or 300 feet? Because it would have to wrap all the way around the building in order to keep it on the property?
I'm not sure I could answer that without looking at things more completely. The only thing I would say about that is that we do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 restaurants that provide exactly 200 feet of code compliant stacking. And so by increasing the standard, you'd be making those 10 businesses legally non-conforming.
Sure.
That doesn't have a practical effect immediately, but over time, that may not be a desired policy direction.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, kind of like to speak for a moment to bullet point number 2 with regards to modifying requirements to account for different drive-through uses. That does seem to kind of make sense. It's a little bit more work for staff and for the commission, I suppose, to consider those, and for us, but it feels as though this very old standard, that's one thing that could improve the overall perception of the standard and the how we consider requests, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah.
That just feels as though that's something that makes sense to me.
Sure. The only challenge I could see to that, and to Commissioner Orman's comments earlier, that would limit the ability and the flexibility of those drive-through uses to become different types of drive-through uses. Part of the reason why those standards were combined in 2018 was to streamline the use table so that there was more flexibility for, if you have, for instance, in that scenario, if you had an existing bank, I'm assuming, or maybe that's bad, an existing dry cleaner, and you wanted to, that closed and it was going to become a coffee shop and it was built with a drive-through, then that drive-through might be built to a lower standard. And in most cases in Mount Pleasant, we're not dealing with exceptionally large parcels of land. This is a pretty densely developed community, and so it may be very difficult to accommodate the adjustments needed to the site to accomplish that. And one of the goals of the master plan is actually to find ways to encourage flexibility of adaptive reuse of buildings, which is really important in our context where we do have an environment that's largely built out. And so site development options would be to reuse existing buildings or to demolish those buildings and rebuild. And adaptive reuse of buildings is certainly going to, in most cases, be a cheaper and faster option to facilitate the reuse of the structure. So that would be my only caution against splitting them out by use, is that
You take away the flexibility.
they may create some opportunities on the front end, and it may create some, or disincentivize or remove some opportunities in the long run.
I guess I also want to think about, like, primarily we're looking at the main differences that we're seeing that are kind of like that, okay, this number of, this 200-foot stacking isn't working for our business is still within the same grouping. It's still restaurant to restaurant. I mean, and so any kind of differentiation between the type of business is not going to change that, where it would be the biggest differentiation where we would see it. I mean, if we differentiate it out between like dry cleaner and, I mean, I don't think we would really see any challenges with how they had it before, but I think that primarily it's going to be more almost like the, like a Taco Bell versus, I mean, like where we're going to see, that they have a significant number of like 2 a.m. traffic and versus, I mean, some of our local business, smaller local businesses. And so I don't know. I know that we all really want to support our local community and helping their ability to thrive. And so I don't know, for maintaining safety purposes and for, and right of ways and things like that. But because, I mean, I live right over by Taco Boy, and I've yet to see that overflow into where that would even come close to going out onto a roadway for honestly, I didn't even know they had the drive-through until it came up as an issue. I mean, it just was, it was such a whereas like, some other places like McDonald's and Big B, you can see the line on a regular basis, but how we could, is there a way to look at this that would make a different, I don't know. I don't know how to look at this as far as being able to, without being like we're doing it per the business, you know, I mean, and have it work with the property.
If I hear you in different ways, you're saying, here we got this policy in place for, was it 38 years for the 200-foot length? And, you know, in general, public policy can't handle everything, but for the most part, this has not been an issue.
Right.
So in that sense, I'm not actually sure why we're spending time on it tonight, because for me, I don't see it as like, it's not broken, don't fix it. Is it perfect? No. But also, every single restaurant is competing with other restaurants.
Right.
And so they're in a competitive ecosystem. On since that 200-foot is a one way, there's a bit more of a level playing field too.
I agree. I'm not sure what we can change to help matters. It seems like things would only get worse if we change something. I mean, maybe there's a change out there that I just don't know of that we can make, but.
And just to counter your point, I mean, let's say we just change the rule for just this one business. This guy decides to close his doors in 5 years, and then another Taco Bell goes over there, and they got the third shortest one over there. Now it becomes an issue,
Right.
you know? And I mean, just to echo what my fellow commissioner said, I mean, it's not perfect. Nothing is, but I mean, it's been, 30-some years. And all of these other businesses, they've complied with it. There's no issues. I mean, other than just, you know, maybe a grand opening here and there. But I mean, you look over to Popeyes, they wish they were that busy still, you know, like it doesn't seem to be an issue, really. So, and just to like echo, I think, you know, the second point, I know it might cause a little bit, and I do appreciate that, Jacob, but I don't know. I think of a restaurant's has restaurant rules, banks have bank rules, dry cleaners. I mean, how many dry cleaners do we even have in the city? Like 2, 3? With a drive-through?
There's more than that,
Is there?
but they don't have a
I
drive-through.
don't dry clean a lot of my clothes, so I'm asking my fellow commissioners. So.
Yeah, I think doing it by type of business is the second best solution, but I think the one size fits all, the flexibility of that is really great, and I think that's the standard we should stick with.
So is it safe to say either 1 or 2? Is that where we're at, or?
Well, I guess I would look to the commission to indicate, I've got some general notes here. And this isn't doesn't have to be like a formal vote, but maybe just by show of hands, if you would be supportive or not supportive of each of these relevant options, just to get a sense of what might be you might be more favorable or less favorable towards, if you're comfortable with doing that. So we kept this in the regular meeting, so you could potentially take a little bit more action. I can lead that, and it doesn't need to be like a motion and second type situation, but just to get a general sense of where the consensus might be.
Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So on the maintaining the existing standard, folks' comfort level or lack of comfort level, okay. In terms of modifying the requirement based on different uses. Modifying it based on a different characteristic of the business, like size or percent of business. Modifying it to a longer or shorter length than the current 200-foot standard. Eliminating the requirement. And then were there any other alternatives that the Planning Commission wanted to suggest?
I'm sure we're all open to alternatives, but I have no idea what alternatives to propose. I don't know about anybody else. Anyone? I guess we don't have any alternatives to propose at this time.
I keep thinking that there's some potential for a small place that is given a waiver or of some kind, and then the business changes, that there could be some rule in place that limits the type of business that can then come into that place, and that limits our flexibility. But are there really so few properties that are available at any given time for a business that wants to have a certain size of an operation? But maybe that's, I'm sorry to elongate the meeting just a couple more minutes.
No,
but
take your time.
it feels as though there's something that could be there. Maybe that's to bullet point 3. Not sure.
Any other thoughts on this topic?
I guess I would just want to add, because it almost feels like, because if we're going to have a special use and it definitely applies to the property and not specific to the business, that the bullet point number 3 seems almost specifically that it does apply to the business of being able to, I mean, because the next, how could you grandfather in the next business coming in if their percentage of business isn't, I guess it just, it would just.
Yeah, there's a lot of logistical issues with
Right.
the third option.
Right. It would be nice if we could, in some ways, to, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with that is not only with the change of businesses over time, but the fact that businesses themselves change over time. And so, like I said at the outset, there was a time not that long ago where this community had 2 McDonald's restaurants, neither of which had a drive-through window. And now we've got McDonald's restaurants with double stacked drive-throughs because the nature of their business has changed over time.
And then you kind of get into going into the business's books, which, take it as you are. And then it becomes a little invasive, because if you're an owner and says, well, my books are my books, so what does the city need to what I'm doing? You know what I mean? There's that argument to it, and I don't blame anyone who has that argument. So, just to kind of echo, I do think, the one size does fit all. I'm looking at the banks, and the banks they match up, and I think I'd go with probably number 1. Number 2 is my number 2, so.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Do you rest on?
State rests. Defense rests.
Okay, it appears we're done discussing this topic, so I'll move on to the next item on the agenda, the work session schedule. Mr. Kane?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I need to locate that in my packet. There we go. So at your work session last month, we talked about your work plan for 2022. I've prepared a draft schedule of work sessions based on the items that you indicated were priorities for discussion this year. And so I'm just providing that for informational purposes. If you have any questions about the schedule, by all means, feel free to let me know. We did this last year as well. We mostly stuck to the schedule. We can't anticipate where you may have extremely large workflows certain months, or other issues might arise that require attention. But in general, staff's intent is to prepare your work session packets accordingly. So we'll look forward to accomplishing many of these items over the rest of 2022.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Any questions for Mr. Kane? Next item on the agenda is staff report. Mr. Kane?
None tonight.
Thank you. Any motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.
Good talk, guys. Good talk.
Is anybody hungry for some tacos?
Yeah.